Okay, my diagnosis story. So sometimes I make the assumption that people already know what my story is. I've talked about it pretty extensively over on my lupus pages on Facebook and Instagram, but I know that there are some people who are new here and some people who have never actually met me before. And come to think of it, I haven't really talked about the diagnosis process in detail, so I guess that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Russia and I'm a teacher in the Philippines, and I was diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus and lupus nephritis back in September of 2016. So I've been living with this for about 4 years now. Exactly 4 years now. What am I saying? Exactly 4 years now. It has come with complications. So for me in particular, it's my kidneys that it's been affecting the most. So I see my nephrologist every month or every 2 months just to monitor my kidneys. But again, lupus is a condition that could affect any of the vital organs. So I've met patients who have had their heart be affected by lupus, or their brain, or their other major organs. So far, it's just my kidneys that we're mainly concerned about. I've had some other complications like migraines and chronic fatigue and chronic pain and arthritis-related problems. So I can talk about all of that in another video. But for this video, what I'm going to be talking about is how I got my diagnosis. So back in 2016, I was working as a teacher, and I was working pretty much full time. I had a full load and I was doing tutorials after school, and it was a very stressful time in my life because I was doing a lot of different things. And in particular, at the time that I was diagnosed, or when I first started seeing my symptoms, it was the end of the school year. So the end of the school year is extra hectic because we have end of year reports, we're wrapping up lessons, we are doing graduation stuff. So there was a lot going on, and I assumed that when I was having body pains and I was feeling sickly, it was all related to stress. Because in the past, when I get stressed out, that's my body's normal reaction. But that was in May. So that was in May. And since it was the end of the school year, I figured that I'll just get through all of that and it'll be summer vacation. So I was looking forward to actually taking a trip with my colleagues because we had planned a trip to Cebu, Bohol, which is, a very popular tourist destination. And I was already starting to feel like pretty sickly at that time. I was having body pains to the point of like not being able to carry my bag. So I had to make the decision of whether or not I would go on this trip. And I figured, I paid for it already and I was looking forward to it. And it was summer vacation. So whatever comes out of it, I always assumed that I had time to actually rest. So I did go on the trip. Like, with hindsight, I know that I shouldn't have because it exacerbated my symptoms. But yeah, once we got to our destination and we had the whole tour. So we planned for a whole tour where we visited different tourist attractions. And it's here in the Philippines, it's summertime and it's hot. And we've been traveling. And my body pains were so bad that in some of the pictures, you can see me in a sling. Like, my arm is in a sling, or like I'm crippled. So what was happening there was there were days when my elbow or my arm would hurt, and so we put it in a sling to kind of stop it from moving around so much, and that kind of contained some of the pain. And there were other times when like my legs were in so much pain that I couldn't even carry the bags that I was holding, and I wasn't sure if I could go on some of the excursions or if I had to stay in the hotel. It was a trip that lasted for a few days, if I'm not mistaken. But by the time I got back to Baguio, I felt so beaten up, like somebody literally beat me up, because the body pains were so painful. So the first thing that I did was to book an appointment with a doctor. And at that time, I didn't have a primary care physician. Like, I didn't have a personal doctor that I had been going to because I never really went to a doctor before. We had our family physician, so that's the one that I went to. And I explained to him, like, I've been having these body pains. And it didn't make sense because they weren't going away. And in the beginning, it was more of like, oh, maybe you're just stressed out and tired. So after a while, when I didn't get better after resting, it became a problem because other symptoms started building onto that. Like, I started noticing hair fall, like excessive amounts of hair fall. I know that people have hair fall and that's normal during certain times of the year, but this was like my hair coming out in clumps, and that was pretty scary. And then the chronic fatigue didn't go away. I know changes in the body can sometimes, like, there are times when I feel regular tired, but this was like extra tired. This is a tired on top of the tired, and it didn't make sense because I wasn't working anymore. It was summer vacation, so it didn't make sense that I was so tired when I didn't really do much that day. And then the symptoms just kept getting worse. So for the next few months, that was from June, July, up until August, actually. We started class in August, and I still wasn't 100% better. I went from doctor to doctor, showing them my symptoms. And the symptoms that were being presented to them were body pains, joint pains, fatigue. I was having symptoms relating to UTI. Like, for those of you who've had UTI, it's like you always need to pee or go to the bathroom, even if I didn't drink any water. So there was that. I was having low-grade fevers, and it was never high enough to be super concerned. Like, I didn't have to go to the ER for that, but I felt very, very weak. Like, I knew there was something wrong. This is not my normal condition. And I also was nauseous. And I think the one thing that tipped us off that something is definitely wrong or definitely different about my body was that I started to have nosebleeds. I haven't had a nosebleed before this since I was in high school, I think. Like, early high school. And that was like 10 years ago. No, more than 10 years ago. So there's this one time that I had my first nosebleed, and I was like, oh no, this is serious. And my mom was also like, you don't usually get nosebleeds. I'm actually anemic. So it's not that anemic people don't get nosebleeds, but it's weird because I usually go in the opposite direction. It's usually that I faint. So if I had fainted, that would have been more normal to me than getting a nosebleed. But yeah, the nosebleed thing freaked us out, where it was to the point that I was definitely like, I have to get this checked because it's not normal. So when I went to the doctors, they couldn't figure out exactly what was wrong with me because there were so many other things going on. So they could explain one thing, like the body pains, they would give me painkillers for that, but it wouldn't stop anything else. And for a lot of it, it didn't make sense given my medical history that I didn't actually have any health problems before this. So it was quite confusing. And by the end of August, it had gotten so bad that I was pretty much crippled. And my joint pains were so strange because they would go from the pain would travel. It would go from one joint, like my fingers, and then it would move to, let's say, my right elbow, and then it would move to my left knee or my right ankle. So, like, when I wake up in the morning, I don't know what's going to be painful anymore. Like, I could anticipate the pain, but I don't know where it was going to hurt and how long it was going to hurt for. And so what I was diagnosed with initially was rheumatoid arthritis. And they called it juvenile rheumatoid arthritis because I was in my 20s. And RA is usually diagnosed for people who are in their 50s or older, so it didn't make sense for a healthy person or a person without a medical history of rheumatoid arthritis to get it at such an early age. So actually, the first doctors that I went to didn't want to diagnose me with that right away. They were looking into it as a possibility, but they couldn't explain to me why it was happening. And nothing they did was actually working because they just kept giving me painkillers. I went from like the base painkiller to a higher level painkiller to a higher level painkiller up until the point that one of my doctors, and it was experimental at this point because nobody knew what was going on. One of my doctors was like, you know what, I'm going to try something. And I can't guarantee it's going to work, but we're going to try it. And if it does work, then what I suspect it is could possibly be your diagnosis. And what he did was, and the pain was in my knee at that point. I was limping, walking into his office. I was limping, and then he got this big needle. I remember being in his office. Got this big needle, stuck it into my knee. I was screaming in pain, and then like he said, give it 10 minutes. And then 10 minutes, I was able to walk out of his office. No pain. What he shot into my knee was steroids. So that was a very big clue for us to figure out that this is related, or the medication that we could use to treat this is actually steroids. And I reported that back to the first doctor that I saw, the primary doctor that I saw on my case. But yeah, aside from the RA, I was also having like the extreme fatigue. Like I said, I wasn't doing much, but I felt like I was so tired all the time, like exhausted. And then the joint pain, actually, it traveled to my hand, where my hand was a claw. It was like this. There were days when I woke up and it was like this. And I couldn't move it. It was just like that. Like my joints were frozen. So that was one of my biggest problems. And then I did have the lupus rash. But nobody knew it was a lupus rash because your lupus rash is supposed to be here, right? And it's supposed to be red. And it's supposed to just like come up over here. That's why they call it the butterfly rash. My rash was here and here, like little spots on my nose and on my forehead, and it was purplish or bluish. It looked like somebody beat me up, but like it was just like maybe this small. It looked like a bruise, and I didn't know what that was, and I didn't think it was a concern. So we had all of these little pieces of a very big puzzle, so that's why it took so long to diagnose. It took months. April, May, June, July, August. 4 months, more or less. Because it wasn't until I met my nephrologist that they said that it could possibly be lupus. And how that happened was with a series of tests that I did. So when I went to all of these doctors, they were like, oh, you have to get this tested. And then they started to eliminate some of the things that it couldn't be. And then I was always reporting back to the first doctor that I saw. So we had like a folder of my medical tests and like all of the comments from the other doctors and all of the medications that they were giving me. And my doctor said, because I got they scanned me and they found out that my kidneys were inflamed and my bladder was inflamed because I was having UTI-like symptoms. They didn't know what was going on. So when they checked, it was inflamed. So they referred me to my nephrologist. And my nephrologist, like, looked through the entire medical history. And when she saw my face and then saw the rash, she said it could possibly be lupus. And at that time it was my parents, and we all kind of looked at each other like nobody has heard that word before. Like nobody told us that could be one of the thinks that it could be. So what she did next was she referred me to my rheumatologist, and then she said, you have to take these tests. These are the tests that will determine if you have lupus, and you can't do it here in Baguio. You have to go down to Manila because none of the hospitals here actually run that test. The hospital that does, St. Luke's Medical Center, is in Makati. So the very next day, I got on a bus, and at that point, I was so, I felt like my body was so banged up. I had to sit in the front because I was so sick, and I just had a blanket on. And then we went down to Manila. It was a 6-hour drive, and I was in a bus and took the test that morning, and then went right back up to Baguio, and we got the results the next day. So with the results, since I didn't understand any of the medical jargon, I didn't understand how to read my tests. It was just a bunch of numbers to me. So when I went to see my rheumatologist, and this is the first meeting I've had, he's kind of old, so he's actually retired. He kind of looks over my tests very calmly, and he goes, well, it looks like you have lupus. And I was relieved, I have to say. I mean, it didn't play out the way medical diagnosis does on TV and in movies, but I was all cried out at that point. I didn't cry in front of my doctor when he told me my diagnosis. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. It was more of finally. It was relief more than anything else, because I had a lot of time to really think about what it could possibly be, and then all of those months trying to find an answer to a question that nobody seemed to have an answer to. It was exhausting. So I was tapped out at that point, and I was like, finally there is a name to what I'm going through, and I can finally deal with it. So what followed after that, of course, was the explanations and the treatments and things like that. And I'll get into that some other time. But basically, that was my diagnosis story. Yeah, it took me 4 months to get diagnosed from the onset of my symptoms. And that's actually not so long, considering there are some patients that I've talked to who didn't find out about their diagnosis until years later, and for some of them it took a stroke or a heart attack before anybody really seriously looked into their condition and they got diagnosed. So I'm glad that that's not what happened with me, that in the end I know what my condition is, and I know how to treat it, and it's being dealt with the way that it's supposed to be dealt with. Yeah, lupus is notoriously hard to diagnose. For those of you who are fans of Dr. House, he always says it's never lupus, because it mimics so many other conditions and other medical diseases that getting a definitive diagnosis is quite hard. So, yeah. I guess that's it. That's the story of my diagnosis. It's weird. I haven't shared that story in a while because it's long. And I'll talk about what happened after that, treatments and whatnot, in the next videos, I guess. But that's it for now. So thank you for sitting with me for the past 20 minutes, and I'll see you next time.